She just seems to think that she's, quote, doing something and sending a message. And it's like, ma'am, the Constitution is not a la carte. You cannot just decide which pieces of it you feel like following. And you cannot suspend constitutional rights by declaring an emergency.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Base Politics Podcast. I'm Hannah Cox with Brad Polumbo. This week, the governor of New Mexico suspends the Second Amendment, Biden lies about 9/11, and much more. Let's jump in. Continuing to be violated, we have to turn our attention to New Mexico, where the governor has apparently just gone absolutely rogue. Brad, you've been following the story as well, I assume.
Yeah, I saw it when it came in, like on Twitter, and I was like, what on earth is going on? Because this seemed flagrant and insane, even by the standards of modern politics. But the governor of New Mexico, a Democrat, she just basically tried to suspend the Second Amendment, right?
Yeah, basically. So I'll give a quick summary, and then we're going to go to some comments from her. But last week, the Democratic governor of New Mexico issued an emergency order under the premise of a, quote, public health emergency, suspending the open and permitted concealed carry of firearms in Albuquerque for 30 days in the midst of a spate of gun violence. Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham says she expects legal challenges to the order, but she still feels she was right to act. The order would fall on the shoulders
I wonder why she expects that, right? Shocking.
No, I mean, we're going to get more into this as we progress in the story, but the comments she has made about her blatant understanding that this is going to get her sued, that it's not constitutional, and that it's not even going to really do much to cure gun violence, it's just kind of shocking to me. Like, she's not even really pretending that this is anything other than a blatant power grab under the guise of public health and safety, but more to that later. Put a pin in that for the moment. The order would, of course, fall on the shoulders of police to enforce and could carry fines up to $5,000. But while police have often enforced unconstitutional laws in our country, it does look like they may be holding the line on this. Albuquerque Police Chief Harold Medina said he won't enforce it, and Bernalillo County Sheriff John Allen said that he's uneasy as it raises so many questions about constitutional rights. Let's roll this clip.
Let me be clear. And I hold my standards high, and I do not or never will hedge on what is right. And I take my oath seriously. In reference to concealed carry and open carry, the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office will not enforce this segment of the order. While I understand the urgency, the temporary ban challenges the foundations of our Constitution, but most importantly, it is unconstitutional. My oath was to protect the Constitution, and that is what I will do. The governor made it clear at her press conference. She knew we as law enforcement did not agree with the order, and as a result, this was solely her decision. Other than this ban being unconstitutional, here are other reasons why I will not enforce the order. One, what many forget, is I have enough violence here in Bernalillo County. I do not want to have political violence towards my deputies or here in Bernalillo County. My job is to keep the peace and to make sure that the citizens of Bernalillo County are safe, and I do not believe that this order will help me do so. I'm a law enforcement professional. This order will not do anything to curb gun violence other than punish law-abiding citizens from their constitutional right to self-defense.
So, Hannah, you love the police now?
I don't know that I would say I love the police now, but I am glad to see them holding the line on this. I will say, again, they often enforce unconstitutional laws every day in this country. But as a whole, when we get to Second Amendment issues, more often than not, when it comes to these just blatant violations, right, I do see them taking a stand. Now, don't get me wrong. They will enforce all kinds of other things that I think are unconstitutional around the Second Amendment, like stop and frisk day in, day out. But it is pleasant to see that there are still some lines that they're not willing to cross here. Guys, New Mexico is what I would call a purple state. It is increasingly a battleground type place. And so where the chips fall in this whole scenario are a little bit less decided, I think, than they might be in a purely red or purely blue state. And that's just important to know for context. But anyways, back to the order. The order says that residents could still transport their guns to their homes or the gun ranges as long as the gun had a trigger lock in place or another mechanism that would prevent its discharge. But residents will not be allowed to have their firearms on them in city streets, parks, or sidewalks, arguably where one would need a gun for self-defense the most. The governor referred to several tragedies that have occurred in the Albuquerque region recently. An 11-year-old boy was killed by stray gun bullets outside a minor league baseball stadium. A 5-year-old girl was murdered in her trailer home by 4 teens who had stolen vehicles and shot up the trailer. And a 13-year-old girl was killed by her 14-year-old friend with his father's weapon while they were playing at his home. Now, these are, of course, awful tragedies, terrible events, but they are very much one-off issues. These are not just mass violence in the streets. I don't understand how you could possibly take these cases and say that it's proof of a public health violence epidemic. But even if that were true, what I would think would be so interesting is that would be a, first and foremost, colossal failing of everybody involved here, of the police, of the governor, of the legislature, of the people who are responsible for setting public policy and enforcing it in the state. And the problem is that so many of our resources often do not go towards actually preventing and solving violent crime. We do very little of that in this country, and I suggest that's because we spend so many of our resources on things like the war on drugs, or in places like New Mexico, chasing around people who are coming here from other countries and locking them in border camps. So I would think that would cause some introspection, but instead we see that the governor is pointing fingers at law-abiding, permit-holding residents of her state. In New Mexico, in order to have a concealed carry permit, as in most states, you have to jump through some hoops. You have to take a firearms training safety class. You have to pay for your license. You have to be in good standing. You can't have a record. You have to be a citizen. It's a pretty lengthy list, and it's not all that cheap to obtain. And when you look at these demographics of people across the country who are permit holders, they are amongst the safest and most law-abiding demographics in existence. These people simply are not people who commit crimes, much less violent crimes. And in fact, we know that guns are used in self-defense between 500,000 and 3 million times per year. So these people are not only not violent, they are the people who often stand in the gap against people who are trying to commit violence.
They also, I wonder, do any of these tragedies that, and I don't know the answer to this, but I suspect the answer is no, involve concealed carry permit holders? All these sound like tragedies related to like minors getting hands on their guns or stray bullets. Maybe that's some gang activity or something, but none of this sounds like concealed carry permit holders are to blame.
No, I've not seen one single incident pointed to that involves anybody in that class. So this is, again, just very much casting a huge wide net that is not going to do anything to stop actual violence. And in a newscast shortly after she issued the executive order, she was asked about some of these points. And Brad, I'm going to roll this whole clip. It's about 1 minute and 45 seconds. I think it is amongst the most infuriating pieces of audio video I've ever consumed. And I want you to listen to her justifications for this. It's absolutely wild.
Yeah. What you're telling us about?
You belong to the Constitution. Isn't it unconstitutional to say you cannot exercise your carry license?
With one exception, and that is if there's an emergency, and I've declared an emergency for a temporary amount of time, I can invoke additional powers. No constitutional right, in my view, including my oath, is intended to be absolute. There are restrictions on free speech. There are restrictions on my freedoms. In this emergency, this 11-year-old and all these parents who have lost all these children, they deserve my attention to have the debate about whether or not in an emergency we can create a safer environment. Because what about their constitutional rights? I took an oath to uphold those too. And if we ignore this growing problem without being bold, I said to every other New Mexican, your rights are subjugated to theirs. And they are not, in my view.
You say about declines. There are laws against declining, so how are they right?
I get it. But again, if I'm unsafe, who's standing up to that right? If this climate is so out of control, somebody should do something. I'm doing as much as I know to do.
Madam Go, do you really think that criminals are going to hear this message and not carry a gun in Albuquerque on the streets for 30 days?
No. But here's what I do think. It's a pretty resounding message.
So, Brad, on the blood-boiling odometer, what level are you at after watching that?
Maybe a 7 or an 8. I just because, the world's a big place with much worse things than this, but like, it's pretty bad. I mean, the part at the end where she admits, no, I don't think criminals will actually listen to this order, but I'm sending a message, is like, oh my goodness. I could almost see, I would still totally philosophically, fundamentally disagree with it. But if she had somehow convinced herself this would save lives, this would do, the kids would survive because of this, I think she'd be totally wrong. And I still think that wouldn't justify ripping up the Constitution. But she doesn't even seem to actually believe that. She just seems to think that she's, quote, doing something and sending a message. And it's like, ma'am, the Constitution is not a la carte. You cannot just decide which pieces of it you feel like following. And you cannot suspend constitutional rights by declaring an emergency. Now, to be fair to her, I know they tried that a lot during COVID, and sometimes they got away with it, or it took years before it was slapped down. But you're still not supposed to be able to do that. It's still wrong and against how things are supposed to work for you to try to do that, even if some politicians have gotten away with it, to be fair to her. And also, I just find the whole thing insane. I mean, the Supreme Court really ruled not that long ago in the Braun case that there is a constitutional right to carry a gun outside a home. You can't just fully suspend that. When she says, like, no right is absolute, I mean, that's actually true under our constitutional order. You can get minor restrictions on the First Amendment or the Second Amendment upheld through the strict scrutiny process, but they almost never do because they're fundamental rights. And those are like narrow things, like just suspend it for 30 days. You can't do that. No one ever would think you could do that. I mean, no constitutional scholars would have advised her, yes, this is within your powers, Madam Governor. I don't know. She seems either ignorant, deeply ignorant of like the Constitution and the law, or totally disregarding it. And I'm not sure which is worse.
I think it's the latter. She's an attorney. She is a governor. I don't think that you can claim to be that ignorant of the law once you're in those positions. And even if you are, you should have staff around you and attorneys generals around you who are informing you what the actual boundaries are. What I find really infuriating in that clip is when she says it will send a resounding message. And my thought was, send a resounding message to who? I think to criminals, that law-abiding people will be disarmed and be more of a sitting duck and easy prey. That's the only message that this sends, that and that you have a blatant disregard for the Constitution and a fundamental lack of understanding around what constitutes a right. She keeps saying this, and she said it during the newscast. She said it during many other interviews since then, that essentially she is concerned about the rights of the people who have been harmed in her state. And she keeps trying to make this false equivalency and saying that essentially people have a right to feel safe, that, she needs to feel safe, her citizens need to feel safe, the people who've had their loved ones taken away need to have justice and to feel safe. And that's incorrect. You do not have a fundamental right to safety. That would be a pie in the sky wish list thing for somebody to hope to achieve, but it's not reality. We live in the real world. We set public policy for the real world. Our Constitution is in place to govern our natural God-given rights. And the way to distinguish that are your rights are things that you would have with or without government, with or without anybody granting them to you. Government can only take them away. And so our Constitution is in place to shield those fundamental God-given natural rights, amongst which is the right to defend yourself. You don't have a right to be safe everywhere you go. That would be great, but it's not realistic, and it's not really anything the government can achieve for you. But you do have a right to defend yourself when you are in situations where you are unsafe, and it is that right that she is impeding. And so her making that false equivalency throughout that video is very upsetting to me, and I do think it's disingenuous. And I also think at the end of the day, not only are you actually violating real rights in doing that, I do think you're making people fundamentally less safe. Because again, we know that guns are used to save more lives every year than they take. And people have a right to defend themselves in the moment. We know police are often far too late to intervene. We know that if they are too late, the likelihood of them solving your case is pretty low. So I think this is a very serious offense against the American people and the people living in her state. And I think from everything I've read about her, this woman does seem to be particularly tyrannical. She was also very bad during COVID, from what I've heard, and very much a Karen kind of COVID type. So this isn't surprising, but I've been telling our audience for some time, you need to be on guard against this public health thing. And I've actually been saying that since before COVID, because I worked on the left. I saw this starting to gain traction when we were doing criminal justice reform. I was often sort of a fly on the wall. I was working with people who I agreed with on criminal justice, but I could sort of learn some things and strategies that they were doing that were maybe going to be used in ways I didn't like. And this was one of them where clearly they saw a real loophole in the law if you can label something a public health issue. And there was a push to start labeling some things around gun issues as a public health issue even back then, or violence as a public health issue. And then during 2020 riots, we saw racism as a public health issue. And then during COVID, we again saw this for the lockdowns. And it's because many of our states and at the federal level, there are some loopholes around public health that are very easy to exploit, that I think are a huge problem to have on the books at all. And I think when you give the government the power to come in and declare something a public health emergency or a public health issue, and in doing so, they then have all these additional powers or can override constitutional rights, you're going to see more and more of this. So this is something that I think the conservative movement needs to be on top of. We need to go on the offense and start laying the groundwork to eradicate those loopholes.
Yeah, no, I agree, because if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. There's no better example of this than the almost 2 year, I think, eviction moratorium that the CDC did. They used some small archaic provision of a law that gave the CDC the ability to like close specific buildings or order them fumigated or other things like that during a pandemic or a emergency with a disease, to declare an almost 2 year halt on evictions nationwide, basically saying that with only a few exceptions that were hard to even get, you couldn't evict non-paying people from your property. So they basically confiscated the rental market nationwide for almost 2 years based on one loophole that was never meant to give them any sort of power, anything close to that. So when you give them emergency powers, they will come up with emergencies, and then they will stretch those powers to their wildest possible limits. So I think stuff like this is just another example of why that's so dangerous.
Well, Brad, what is interesting to me about this is I agree with everything that you said, and it is so egregious, it is so over the line that we are actually seeing pushback against her from some very surprising voices on the left. And I'm not going to lie, when I saw these next two tweets I'm about to read you guys, my jaw fell on the floor. It was Saturday afternoon. I was heading to a special Shabbat service in town. I put everything on hold to make a video covering this because I was flabbergasted. And so first up, we have one of our arch nemesis that we're usually criticizing pretty heavily for his activism, David Hogg, who was the kid whose sister went to Parkland. I don't even think he was at Parkland when it happened, but he became an anti-Second Amendment, anti-gun activist after Parkland and has amassed a huge following. And I've never seen him push back on any gun regulation to date, but he came out against this on Twitter. He quote tweeted a CNN Politics story about the governor's order suspending open and concealed carry of guns in Albuquerque. And he said, I support gun safety, but there is no such thing as a state public health emergency exception to the U.S. Constitution.
Based,
super based. And then I saw Ted Lieu, who is a very progressive, again, very anti-gun congressional member, come out and he quote tweeted the same article. And he said, I support gun safety laws. However, this order from the governor of New Mexico violates the U.S. Constitution. No state in the union can suspend the federal Constitution. There is no such thing as a state public health emergency exception to the U.S. Constitution. And I think this is not only based, but it shows that some people still have something of their wits about them to recognize if you set this precedent, it is very quickly going to be weaponized against you by right-wing state governors against other things that we like. I mean, you don't have to be based to understand how quickly big government and this kind of usurpation of powers can be used against you in ways that would be harmful to something you do like. So I was glad to see them come out in that way.
Yeah, I agree. I was glad to see them call it out, but I just think it's a case where it's so egregious, even progressives who have even a little bit of their blind spot awareness can see that it's just unconstitutional, right? And so even CNN, Poppy Harlow, interviewed the governor and pushed her on this, and CNN kind of based. Take a listen.
Because the Supreme Court last year totally changed what we're allowed to do, what you're allowed to do. And they said unless you can base it in the history and tradition, you don't have grounds to do something like this. The New Mexico Constitution, I looked last night, Article 2, Section 6 says this, quote, "No law shall abridge the right of citizens to keep and bear arms for security and defense. No municipality or county shall regulate in any way any incident of the right to keep and bear arms." Are you not in violation of both the U.S. Constitution and your state's Constitution?
I don't believe that we are. And if that narrow reading of the Constitution, which has been tested in the state, we wouldn't have universal background checks. We wouldn't have a waiting period. We wouldn't have a red flag law. We wouldn't have prohibitions for straw purchases. None of those would have been deemed constitutional. And today, all of them are.
They were before
These
the Supreme Court
absolute right
ruled
discussions.
So I think it's very interesting to see CNN just call her out like this. Props to them. But also her response is like, well, we have these other piecemeal minor restrictions. So that means a total ban will fly too. Like, no, that's not how courts work or how, judicial scrutiny applied to restrictions on constitutional rights ever works. And also, again, those were all upheld before the Supreme Court's new standards set out in Braun, that case that specifically upheld a right to constitutional carry, or concealed carry, rather, not constitutional carry, not yet. And so I think it's just doomed to be struck down, and even CNN can see it. And the governor, watching her there, she doesn't look like she believes what she's actually saying.
No, and also what I thought was so striking about this clip is that she lists off all these gun control items they've gotten across the finish line. Yet, according to her, her state is overrun with gun violence and is having a public health emergency that's so terrible she needs to override the Constitution. And I think that at that point you don't sit back and even if you are genuine, I don't think she is, but let's say you are someone who genuinely thinks gun control works and solves violence, and this is how you keep people safe and protect kids. If you honestly step back and look at the ability of them to pass those kinds of laws and the fact that that has still not actually made people safer or made them one of the safer states in the country, and realize that perhaps you're targeting the wrong thing in order to get this end goal. I think a lot of people who are anti-gun are simply afraid. They see bad things happening. They want to have some kind of solution, and that's understandable, but it's important to remember that people who are afraid are often easily misled. And I think there are many people working with our government who have ulterior motives when it comes to gun control. It's more about population control, and they use these kinds of guises of pointing to violence or public health to get people who are afraid to go along with their ulterior motives. And reality is, if you really sit down and you look at the numbers, there is no evidence that gun control is going to make you safer. It is missing the mark entirely. If we want to address root causes of criminality and violence, which, by the way, I've spent a large portion of my career doing, there are much smarter, more effective ways of doing that I think leaders like this governor should be paying attention to, instead of going after people who are law-abiding, who are simply trying to protect themselves, and again, who could actually protect others in the streets when police fail to. Hey guys, Hannah here. Big things are happening at Base Politics, and we want to make sure you stay in the loop with all of our productions and developments. If you like the Base Politics podcast, you can find it every Wednesday morning on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Brad's YouTube. You want to support the show? Be sure to join the Base Politics Locals channel, where you can help produce it for only $5 a month. You can also catch our new shows, Propaganda and Damage Control, every Saturday on our respective YouTubes and Facebook channels. On Damage Control, Brad teams up with right-of-center LGBT guests to restore sanity to the increasingly unhinged debate over these issues. And on Propaganda, I'm taking video footage of police behaving badly every week and using those videos to expose problems within U.S. policing and the laws that guide it. Remember, Base Politics is a nonprofit organization dedicated to moving the culture through content. If you want to be a part of these efforts, you can donate to fund our work at base-politics.com.
All right. Well, let's now go back to President Biden and 9/11, because what would such a somber day be without another gaffe from our commander-in-chief? Hannah, I know you saw this clip. Everybody's seen this clip, but for the audience, if you haven't, take a listen.
I join you on this solemn day to renew our sacred vow: never forget, never forget. We never forget. Each of us, each of those precious lives stolen too soon when evil attacked. Ground Zero in New York, and I remember standing there the next day and looking at the building. I felt like I was looking through the gates of hell. It looked so devastating because from where you could stand.
So, Hannah, I mean, this is just on its surface a perfectly normal statement, except for the problem that Joe Biden did not go to Ground Zero the day after 9/11. He went almost 2 weeks later, and so this is a lie or a false statement. And I was trying to decide in my head, which is worse, whether he is lying and knowing it, or he's so addled in his brain now that he can't even remember, the day after 9/11 versus 2 weeks later. Which is worse?
That's a great question. I think the former is worse than the latter, but only slightly, because the former, if you're lying and trying to say you were there before you were, it's such a ambulance chaser kind of thing. I can't stand when people do this. Whenever there's a crime or a tragedy, they try to immediately put themselves in the middle of it and find ways to make themselves seem closer to it than they actually are. It's a really gross side of human nature I've seen around multiple instances. That was my take on this when he did that. For the record, guys, this was not September 12th of 2001. It's not like it was open for tourism, that people were just walking around Ground Zero. They were still pulling bodies out of the rubble for weeks. They were still worried there might be other bombs or things going off in that area. The George W. Bush was not even there by 9/12. I think he showed up around 9/14 or somewhere around there once they had actually made sure it was safe for him to be there. This was not something where they were congressional members, come take a tour of the remains. This is it's a ludicrous statement. You were a senator at this time. We know where you were. People would have had it on record if you actually were there. So if he's lying, it is such a bizarre thing to try to make up, and just very disrespectful to all of the first responders and people who did lose their lives and who were there in that moment. And it's just a senseless lie. What difference does it make to say that versus the truth that you went 2 weeks later? It's ridiculous, but I don't know, given his history of lying, and of especially lying in this capacity to make himself seem like he is more in the weeds on things than he is, I think he probably is lying. But the idea that he's just so old and doesn't remember certain dates, that's, certainly plausible as well.
Yeah, I think morally it's worse if he's lying, but for the state of our republic and having our commander-in-chief be mentally competent, I think it's actually worse if he's so mentally addled that he can't remember basic things, or just accidentally says massive falsehoods. So here's the fact check from checkyourfact.com. My friend Elias Atienza actually went and fact checked this thoroughly. So his claim is false because C-SPAN video from September 12th, 2001 shows that he was at a Senate session in Washington, D.C., voting on a resolution to condemn the attacks on that day. The vote occurred at 1:45 p.m. Eastern, and the roll call showed he voted yes. So he was there in the afternoon. And then they couldn't account for his entire day, but then he also appeared for an interview on September 12th at night, and it identified him as in Washington, D.C., not New York City. They reviewed the entire interview, and he never gave any indication that he was visiting or had gone there that day. They discussed the attack, they discussed Osama bin Laden, etc., and he, of course, condemned the attack. There were no articles that reported on Biden visiting New York City the day after. And in fact, former President George W. Bush, like you mentioned, did not visit until September 14th. So it is basically impossible to believe that some senator would have gone in the next day when the president couldn't even go in for several more days. Now, when they asked the White House, checkyourfact.com, they referred them to articles published by CNN and the Associated Press showing that Biden visited the sites of the attacks on September 20th, which is more than a week after what he claimed in his remarks. So they didn't even try to defend what he said. I think they just, I mean, like they can't even really try anymore. They've given up.
Can you imagine having to work in communications for Biden? I mean, that would be one of my
just
worst
kill me
nightmares.
now.
Yeah, I mean, the amount that they have to pivot and parlay and try to fact check and dance around, it's constant cleanup duty for them, I'm sure. I bet they're very tired. But yeah, again, this is not a hard thing to debunk. And that's why it's such an outrageous lie. And again, a senseless lie. I'm tired of him doing this. Just be a good leader, show up, care for people, show that you're there to respond to them. I mean, we don't need this. We don't need you making up stories about your proximity to the tragedy or how you also had similar tragedies in your background. It's just bizarre behavior. So,
I mean, so Trump lied a lot, right? And Biden campaigned against Trump in 2020 on decency and normalcy and like restoring America's reputation for decency and all this. And then he's just run around and done the same kind of thing all the time. And just because the media doesn't report on it nearly as much, it's like, oh, our image has improved. Well, we're still doing a lot of really pathetic. I mean, I guess I'm not actually old enough to remember 9/11. I was too young. But I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody who lost a family member or a loved one who watches this clip of the president of the United States lying to clout chase that they were there the next day when they weren't. That must be really insulting. That must feel really disrespectful.
I mean, I was just a kid when it happened too, but I find it insulting because, again, we were all watching this go down. We were all watching, I mean, for days. I don't think we did anything but watch the news as this was going down. And so everybody feels particularly touched by this, no matter where you were in the country. And I think that is something that speaks to American unity in a beautiful way, right? I saw somebody else point out yesterday that despite the fact that these attacks were carried out on New Yorkers, you saw people in the Midwest and rural states rush to join the military to defend them and even to die to defend them, right? And our wars that they thought they were fighting to get justification for this. And so I think that, to me, all Americans, especially those who were living during that time and watching during those days, feel very impacted by this to this day. It is something that's quite emotional for all people. Don't try to one up other people and be like, but I was closer to it. Or like, it's just those, again, it's the ambulance chasing kind of thing of like, well, my second cousin was there, so I'm more affected by the tragedy than you, or I was actually there that day. And I can't stand that kind of thing.
And it's the narcissism. Again, it's the desire to make things immediately about yourself. Like, talk about the victims, talk about the country, talk about the heroes that, like, I am in awe at the firefighters who rushed in and lost their lives but saved people. But then, or you hear all these, I was just reading stories while I was sitting at jury duty. On my phone, I was just reading stories about 9/11 and all these heroic everyday people, firefighters. You shared the thing about the people who just got in their boats and started helping, but other people like got their office evacuated from the second tower, even though they weren't supposed to, or they were telling them to stay put, but they didn't listen, or and they saved lives and they went back to save more and then they died. Like those are the things that a president should be remembering and uplifting. Not making it about himself, and then even worse, lying and making it about himself. Like, no one cares where you were, Joe. We care about our country and how it responded to this attack that was so terrible. So to me, it's just another massive cell phone because they give us these clips, they give us this fodder, and you and I aren't even, like, we're not, hardcore partisans or anything. So it's like, we'll criticize him when he deserves it. But there are many people, like there always are in partisan politics, just looking for ammunition against the other side. And it just seems like the Biden White House is determined to gift them it all the time.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful point, Brad. I'm glad you said that because there are so many stories of 9/11 and of heroism and of what I think makes me proud to be an American to this day, right? The actual fabric of this country, the values that we hold. And it's something that I get to experience working in politics. When we get off the line, I tell people this all the time, like, Americans are pretty good. Americans actually will do a lot to help each other. They're very charitable people. They're very giving people. We do still have this like really amazing social fabric that runs across our country. And that's incredible considering how diverse we are and how big we are. And while I think 9/11 was one of the darkest days of our history, I do think the American spirit shone brighter than ever that day, and that we should be pointing back to that ability to come together and trying to overcome the partisanship and overcome the hostility. And Biden and really, you know, his two predecessors before him don't really seem to have a lot of interest in that. They all really play into the tribalism and pitting one camp against the other one. And if he's going to run on things like decency and unity, that has to mean something. And that actually has to mean putting your partisanship aside and finding ways to try to overcome that barrier and extend olive branches. We never see that from him or his camp. And it's really sad because I think we could very much use that kind of person as a leader right now in this country. And at the very least have somebody who could point to times in our history where we have seen more of that across the population. So I don't foresee this getting better anytime soon, given how everything's shaking up for the next year or two. But you know, you didn't get to grow up with this as much. I did. Like, as much as I don't like W. Bush's policies or Clinton's policies and even some of Reagan's policies, these were people that I do think really seemed to love America and didn't have this hostility towards the other side, and like really did espouse, you know, optimism in their viewpoints and tried to make it as much about the people and the people coming together to overcome their problems as they could. And I hope that at some point in our future, we get back to that.
Yeah, me too. But you know what I don't want to get back to? The glory days of the Soviet Union. However, in our next quick hit, we're going to talk about somebody named Jackson Hinkle, who is I honestly thought, I still think he's a troll account. Like, I think it's a deep fake. But I want to play this interesting clip for you where he was on the show of a YouTuber named Tim Pool, who has a massive show on YouTube. And Jackson Hinkle argued for MAGA communism. Take a listen.
Do you identify as communist?
Yes.
What is the value of communism?
Orienting government and the economy for the public good.
Yeah, but I think that's like an oversimplification.
Well,
or idealistic.
You said simply that's what it is. I mean, I think that any communist state that takes form in America is going to have communist values, or American values rather. It's going to be based on the history of our country, the Constitution. I think it would be a Christian communist state. And I think that we can learn a lot from China and from the Soviet Union. But you look at China today, their economy is outpacing ours. It's gonna beat ours totally probably within the next 5 to 10 years. You know, Europe is going down, the US is going down. China lifted 845 million people out of poverty in the last 40 years. I think that we shouldn't be China, but I think we can learn things from China and the Soviet Union and other countries that have done it successfully.
Successfully?
Do you think China
Union didn't do it successfully? Fell apart.
Yeah, well, they fell apart in 69 years.
So I feel like I lost brain cells watching that, but I do want to address this because this guy, while he's not super serious, he is getting platformed and, you know, reaching millions of people on these shows. But on China, so the worst parts of China's current society and system, their social credit score, their oppression and genocide of Uyghurs, a religious minority, their totalitarian infringements of civil liberties, their, you know, control on punishing of dissenters and disappearing people who speak out against things. Those are all directly tied to the communist elements of their governmental system. But the massive reductions in poverty that they've seen have actually come as they liberalized their economy, not in the classical sense. As they adopted pro-market reforms, millions of people were lifted out of poverty through the economic growth that generated. It was not state-run economics, you know, command and control communism that lifted them out of poverty. It was the communist government maintaining an iron fist, but allowing some markets to operate, basically, in their economic system because they knew that what they were doing wasn't working. So this is just completely illiterate economically. And then to cite the Soviet Union positively, just, you know, forget the gulags, the stagnation, the repression of the people, the fact that it imploded. How can someone actually credulously make this kind of argument, let alone claim that it's somehow conservative or MAGA or patriotic? To me, I mean, it's anti-American. It sounds like something you'd hear some crazy far leftist say, not a supposed patriot, America-loving conservative.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this guy, but I'm inclined to think you're right that he must be trolling because I can't think of how you could credibly make this with a serious face. It is so easily debunked. It's so easy to know that China was starving its people. They were in utter decline. And not only that, but they've killed millions of people leading up to that point under communism, under their brutal regimes and inhumane philosophies. But by the 1970s, their people were starving, their economy was in shatters, and they were desperate to trade with capitalist countries. And it is because of that trade, of that commerce, of that capitalism that they are dipping their toe in the water in to trade with countries like the United States and others, that they are now seeing a reversal in some of those trends. Without capitalism, their country would have gone to utter rot, and they knew that, and that's why they agreed to open up those components of it while still keeping a very big iron fist on other sides of their way of life. China is a terrible place to live. It is a disgusting regime. They frequently do disappear people for merely saying things online, for holding views. There was a really in-depth New York Times profile just a couple weeks ago about a man who was running what it came down to as a libertarian blog and talking about books like 1984. And they disappeared him, and now he's being charged and sentenced with no due process, no actual trial for years and years and years. His wife has not been able to see him. She's now having to go undercover. The fact that anybody would try to point to this as something that we could learn from, I think you're either unhinged or you're a hack. It's not excusable. And I honestly would love to buy this guy a one-way ticket to China so that he can go and soak up all that knowledge.
So you know how they say, like, oh, people who are anti-Ukrainian are all pro-Putin or something? That's obviously not true. This guy actually is pro-Putin. If you go to his Twitter, he's posting like love posts about Vladimir Putin. He thinks Putin is like the savior of Western values or something, even though he literally persecutes certain types of Christians. I mean, I don't even know about all that, but it's just crazy. I don't know how somebody like this, but I guess to go back to the China thing for a second, one of the most interesting relationships and friendships I had in college was with a woman named Victoria, who was a year or two younger than me. She was an exchange student at UMass from China. And I remember we were in a club together. I competed in mock trial, and we would travel around the Northeast together to go to our competitions. And so I spent a lot of time with her. And I remember just the marvel that she had at the first time she experienced an American gas station. How many varieties of candy there were, how many options there were for soda, how cheap everything was, how much food you could get for so little money. It all just stunned her. And then I remember she was floored when she learned that citizens could own guns. She was just like shocked. And she goes, "That's amazing." And I'm like, yeah, I guess I never really thought about it, but it kind of is. Right? Because there, only the state has weapons. And these citizens don't even really own their own property because it can all be kind of commanded and seized by the state. And they have social credit scores and all this crazy stuff. And so I agree. I am not a fan of deporting people, but I am all 100%, generally speaking, I support deporting like violent criminals and stuff. But I think we should fund self-deportation for people like this. So not force them, but offer to give them a taxpayer-funded one-way ticket to the authoritarian country of their choice. The only attachment is they can't come back, and we're going to give an extra green card to somebody who loves America from India or a freaking Hong Kong refugee or something like that to replace them. That's my proposal.
I wholeheartedly support that plan. I do want to make one big significant point here, and I have to kind of parse this out slowly because I don't want to conflate everybody under this umbrella. But I think that this guy and his point of view and some of the things that he is espousing under the name of MAGA and nationalism are the main points why people like me and you and others on the right have had a lot of problems with Trump and his base and some of the mentalities and ideologies within it. And I want to be clear, I don't think everybody who supports Trump is caught up in this. I think there are some people who just see it as always as a lesser of two evils type equation. I think there are other people who, care more about the economy than they do anything else. And they think one person will do better at that than the other. So they lean into it. I also just think there's some people who are kind of caught up in general tribalism and aren't thinking that deeply about what's actually being pushed or the agenda items that are being pointed to under various administrations. When it comes to the actual ideologies, though, that have undergirded the Trump administration and continue to really be his guiding philosophy, and especially the philosophy of many of the sort of demagogue type people who are working around him. It is this. It is nationalism. And I do think nationalism is a very dangerous, problematic ideology. I think it goes so far right that it meets socialism, and they have a lot of overlap within them. And the reason that people in this camp, like Putin, like China, actually see some favorable things to point towards to them under, it's because they like authoritarianism. They like a strongman leader. That's why many of them were attracted to Trump. They saw him as having the ability to be that kind of strongman to come in and just demolish your enemies and push your way of life on others. They believe in that. They see that as what they want to happen under government. It's a very big government philosophy. It's a very anti-capitalist philosophy, and we've seen that carried out with numerous policies under Trump, including things like his trade policies. And I think that people need to get a bit more wise to this, because it's not everybody within that camp, but when you get into the national conservatism, there is a lot of this, and the people
I will just
are guided by that.
Push back slightly that Trump also had a lot of classically liberal economic policies, like his tax cuts, his massive deregulation of the economy, and then he had some that were this nationalist, big government, anti-capitalist, like the tariffs. So I think it's like a mixed bag, but I think there's definitely, you're right, that there's this piece of the base that identifies with this, or at least maybe this is the most extreme version of the sentiment they identify with, and I think it's a very toxic road to go down. I don't think Trump himself I think he embodies the vibe somewhat, like his strongman vibe, but his actual policies, I do not think were ever fully nationalist. I think they weren't.
He was balancing it, but the people who were working alongside of him, I don't think Trump is an ideologue. I think Trump is out for himself and just wants to do whatever is going to get him further ahead. But he was convinced by people like Steve Bannon that this was the ideology that he was going to be able to advance to do it. And many of his biggest policies, like trade, like immigration, they were baked in this. Now, he did, I think, as you pointed out, sort of supplement some of that with ideas that were not very bad. I mean, the tax cuts were good. He didn't cut spending, which should have accompanied that. He was good on deregulation. There were some good elements to what he was doing. But as a whole, the mentality he was pushing and what we have seen many of the people who've been supporters of his continue to push is this weaponization of government against your political enemies or against private enemies, like we've seen with DeSantis and Disney. And I think that this is sort of the if there is an ideology that undergirds the Trump administration, it is this one. And the people who are working, which are typically the people who are really steering the ship, right? It's not just the politicians themselves, but it's who they put around them. You do have quite a few people who share this kind of belief system and mentality. And I think that it does ultimately flow into actual national conservatism. And there are a lot of ties between national conservatism and a socialist system. And that's why you see them flirting with these socialist regimes and dictators. So people need to be more on guard of that, look into those philosophies more deeply, and really understand what it is that you're being sold.
Speaking of looking into philosophies more deeply, let's take a look at what happened at a recent Democratic Socialist convention. An outlet named The Free Press, founded by ex-New York Times journalist gone independent Barry Weiss, who I'm a big fan of, and a reporter named Ben Kowaler, sorry if I mispronounced that. He went to the Democratic Socialists of America's convention in Chicago, and then it didn't go great. Let's roll this extended, it is lengthy, clip from the reporting that he produced.
I think we should abolish capitalism, but how do we do that? It won't happen all at once.
But gradually, I won't be able to buy anything.
I was at McCormick Place in Chicago for a convention of the Democratic Socialists of America.
I wouldn't call us in a pre-revolutionary situation. We're in a pre-revolutionary situation.
I was there with an open mind. After all, I've always thought of the left as fighting the good fight.
You know that democratic promise that we have supposedly in this country of a government formed by the people? I don't see it.
Became disillusioned with, how we treat the working poor in the United States and elsewhere, right?
Together we can be a force against our shared enemies, fascism, imperialism, racism, and capitalism. Basically all the isms.
My question for these people was about that last ism, capitalism. Now, I'm no economist, but I can Google. Basically, capitalism is what you have when businesses are privately owned and operate for profit. You may notice that capitalism describes nearly any business you can think of, from superstores to your local hair salon. Does all of that really have to go?
You're afraid that there's not going to be like a consumer
people
economy
like to have
or whatever.
stuff, you know? Like
but there's no reason to think there won't be stuff. It's very strange.
Do you feel like we need to abolish capitalism?
In time, yes.
How do we do that, and what comes after?
I'd like to see it become like a Star Trek utopia. You know, that's just me.
Does anyone say, hey, can we maybe not be like, oh, we need to get rid of all of capitalism everywhere? Like, has anyone expressed that?
I think that would be a shortcut to achieve wider consciousness.
Where do I get a sandwich in your socialist utopia?
At the corner store.
It's a very bizarre question.
Sadly, I was kicked out before I could talk to anyone less evasive.
Give me your credentials. Thank you. Ma'am, can I have your credentials, please?
I don't understand.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's just how it's going to be. So.
Well, that's awfully authoritarian. I mean, what?
No, it's just how it is.
You know, we're an abolitionist organization. We don't believe in polite police, but the hotel has its own kind of procedures for how they handle it.
We left before the abolitionists could remove us by force. But then I noticed another event taking place. And these people seemed fun, positive, not hostile. I'm at the Black Women's Expo. I had stumbled upon a convention for Black female entrepreneurs.
We have mango honey tea, we have pineapple honey tea, and we have peach honey tea.
Now this was more like it.
I love that reaction.
That is a delicious candle. I wish I could eat it.
Oh.
Are these all candles?
These are all candles.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Can I smell this one?
Sure.
Ooh, I like that. It's good and fruity. Okay.
I came here to cover socialism, but now I was luxuriating in the sights and smells of sweet, sweet commerce.
I have 15 businesses. So I have a therapy business, a cleaning business, drop shipping, e-commerce.
These were some of the most rabid capitalists I'd ever met.
And so I make like tumblers, I make the glass cups, which is here.
This is Bitch Be Gone. It kills 99% of thoughts and bitches. And it eliminates hoes.
I'm an author of 17 books.
17 autobiographies. I wish I could be both this productive and this self-involved. I have the second part down.
I couldn't resist talking politics.
Do you think we should get rid of capitalism?
No, it's a part of our everyday life.
In my honest opinion, it's necessary. The world doesn't work without it. It just doesn't.
Capitalism is a thing. It's never going anywhere.
It doesn't really benefit certain people, and then it does others. It can benefit you if you know how to actually make it work for you. That's just the way the world works. You have to live with what you got.
So, for me at least, it did not surprise me how many of these self-described democratic socialists or whatever really were ill-equipped to describe their exact alternative to capitalism, right? Or how it will actually work. Because for me, those types tend to have a lot of pie-in-the-sky notions about workers will rule, or everything will be decided based on fairness and needs, but the actual implementation is not, often something they've thought through very much.
Yeah, this is why I often say I think socialism is a childish ideology. I don't think it's grounded in an understanding of human nature, of systems, of how countries have operated, and even of just like the failures of the various systems throughout history and what has succeeded, what has not. So I wasn't surprised to hear this. I did laugh a good bit at the guy who said his mentality was he hoped it could be like Star Trek. the lack of depth that people are putting into this, and yet they're at a conference discussing, I guess, ways to overthrow capitalism. So the good news is for us, I don't think they're anywhere close to figuring it out. So I'm glad that these are not super effective, deep people, because then we might actually be in trouble. But I did think it was sort of funny that you can just tell nobody's ever talked to them outside their bubble, right? Nobody's ever pushed back on them or really made them defend their beliefs or explain how they might put them into practice. And I do think that's quite in contrast to people in our camp, for example. I'm constantly being asked to defend my views, to defend capitalism, to explain how I might do things differently than the two parties that I'm pushing back against. And that's good. I appreciate that kind of rigor. And, I always want to be aware of holes in my thinking, so I don't mind that at all. But I do just think it's interesting how much we're put on the defense when it comes to our views, even though they've had more success than any others throughout history. And yet people with this mentality just get a pass all the time.
I do find it deeply hilarious that they kicked him out. I'm not surprised. I think he was kind of surprised because this journalist is a liberal journalist, I assume, because the Free Press is more of a liberal, kind of like independent, critical, liberal leaning outlet. So I shouldn't say that. I don't know what he is, but my guess is that he's a liberal journalist. So he thought like, oh, I'll go discuss, we'll exchange ideas. Yeah, people on the super progressive left are really not into that. They don't vibe with that. So the idea that he was thrown out doesn't shock me in the slightest.
Not one bit. I think it's very funny that people have this, again, just completely ungrounded in history understanding of how socialists operate. They're very authoritarian. They do not handle dissent very well. They definitely have not upheld civil liberties by any stretch of the imagination when they have tried to put this philosophy into practice. So I thought this was exactly in keeping with what you would suspect to see. But I think more people should be exposed to this kind of person. And I hate to throw everybody in this camp under the bus. I'm sure there are many well-meaning people who are just not very educated who fall into like Marxist socialist beliefs. But I often do say you can tell how good an ideology is by how the vast majority of people who believe in it behave and conduct themselves. And when you look at how Marxists and socialists interact with others, how they cannot play nice with others whatsoever, and how they very quickly are hypocritical about their values when they're tested in any way, I think is indicative of just the complete failings of this philosophy. And I think
Which
it shows.
is so funny because their whole philosophy is like rooted in the idea that people will just take care of each other and don't need to, they can overcome their self-interest and we can all just operate for the greater good. And yet when they're not very, gregarious in these kinds of situations, I mean, I just find it hilarious. I will say the socialist convention crowd, from the clips he published, is very white and very male. And a lot of masks, a lot of masks and a lot of beer bellies. Or gamer bellies, more accurately. I will say I found it so hilarious that this was unplanned and they just happened. He went to this convention in Chicago, and at the convention center, there happened to also be a convention for Black women entrepreneurs. And you go there, and I'm like, this is amazing. This is like the best part of capitalism. All these small business owners going out there and providing goods and services that are unique, that are sophisticated, that are beautiful. Some of the stuff they show, if you're just listening, is really cool. It's really intricate. They're meeting people's needs, making the world a better place, and making themselves money and providing for their family at the same time, while also being, people who the left would say are marginalized in society, yet they're the ones out here hustling and thriving, while a bunch of, white dudes are down the hall bitching about how rigged the system is and they can't get ahead.
I loved this. I loved it so much for so many reasons. First and foremost, I think Black women make the world go round. I mean, these women I've had the opportunity to work around many Black women entrepreneurial types, and they are incredible, the things that they're achieving and doing, and they don't sit around and complain about it. They just go do it. And if there's a barrier, they find a way around it. And they have this incredible community, I've noticed, that I haven't often found in my own situations and circles, where they really do uplift one another and empower one another and try to shop at each other's businesses. And it's excellent. It's so great. And what I find so interesting about this is, yes, the irony of like these Black women just getting out there, getting it, being successful, making products that make people's lives better. And then the like loser white men sitting around the corner feeling sorry for themselves and feeling like they need a bigger hand up. That's a hilarious contrast. But I also think, you often have on the right these images pushed of like welfare queens and people in the Black community don't want to work, and like all of these equally like ridiculous assertions that if you actually just go spend time in the Black community, you will be quickly dissuaded of. And yet, when we saw this conference, I'm just struck by the fact of like these people should be like right-wing supporters and would be if two conditions were met. One, the right actually stood for capitalism, which I argue it very rarely does, more so than the left, but like not consistently at all. And two, just did basic outreach, right? Like people often act like Black people or Hispanic people are just a given for the left. And that's one argument you'll hear against immigration all the time on the right, of like they're just trying to get more voters. There is absolutely no reason that Black communities or Hispanic communities or any other community would just happen to be Democrat. except for the fact that the right doesn't do basic outreach. They don't go into these communities. They don't actually get to know these people. They don't take time to understand the issues they actually care about. When they do try to do anything whatsoever, it's often very pandering.
Oh, you mean like black people need to wake up and leave the Democrat plantation? Like, that's not offensive and cringe.
Right. Or they'll empower, these Black Republican commentator types who actually are very anti-Black in their messaging, who I don't think have really ever spent that much time in the Black community from things that they say, and that again are quite griftery and not reaching the average day in, day out Black person, who again is often very entrepreneurial, very much a believer in capitalism, often has had a long history of understanding the problems of big government and the way it's been weaponized against their community. These people
They're also often socially, they are not woke. They're not hard left.
And I got to add one other thing, guys, I think is equally crazy. But I've seen people on the right saying, like with Trump being charged here in Georgia and the fact that he's being overcharged, that's going to really get the Black community on his side because they also hate the criminal justice system. And I'm like, no, as somebody who has worked criminal justice reform, let me tell you, the Black community, number one, not normally with you. They're often pushing for stiffer penalties in the justice system because they're often having to live in these crime-ridden neighborhoods that police are failing to actually clean up. And so, one, first and foremost, they're not automatically with you on the criminal justice reform thing, period. Two, to insinuate that because Trump got overcharged, all the Black community is going to be upset because I think your end point here is that all the Black communities had run-ins with the justice system, which is racist and wrong and just not correct whatsoever. But these are the things that I think are such a problem when you don't spend time actually getting to know the people you're trying to reach. You'll look like a clown when you try to message to them or talk about them, and you really miss the mark. And I think that this kind of interview is proof of why there should be a lot more outreach going on and a lot more bridge building happening in these communities. And I think you'd find that we have a lot of commonality and a lot of things we could work on together. But instead, the right just, demonizes people or strawmans them or completely misses the mark with things that they care about. And I hope this kind of video would wake people up to that because I've seen this for many, many years in my work now.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's round out the show with some hot takes. Hannah, what do you have for us?
Okay. My hot take is that old people have the best candy and I don't know where they're getting it. I can't figure it out. I want to get my hands on it. Have you ever had those strawberry hard candies? They come in
They are good.
But where do you buy those?
I have no idea.
You've never seen them for sale, right? And you only ever get them from old people. I know. I've thought about this in depth. And there's a few others. There's those they're in a yellow kind of ceramic wrapping and they're like a caramel type.
Yeah, I don't like those.
Oh, I love those. And then the last one is a green peppermint. Not a red peppermint, but a green peppermint, like a spearmint type peppermint. Only old people ever have these candies. I think they're delicious. I don't know where they're buying them. So I guess make friends with old people. They'll share their candy. But at the end of the day, is there an old person candy store? Are they sharing these things at meetups? Where are they getting their candy?
Okay. My hot take is that people need to stop shaming others for enjoying reality TV. Yes, we know it's not realistic. Yes, we know it's vapid. Yes, we know it's trashy. That's why we like it. It's escapism. So I recently started watching The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City so that I could get an idea of what everyday life in Utah is like. That's a joke, people. It's just totally different. Though there is a lot of interesting stuff that in the show about Mormons. Some of them are Mormons, some of them are ex-Mormons, some of them are not Mormons, and all the dynamics there are interesting. I'm not under the delusion that they're representative of what Utah or Salt Lake City are actually like. I said that and I'm joking. But a lot of people, when I tweeted about this, they're like, why would you do that? Or aren't you smarter than that? Or seriously? And I'm like, you know what? Piss off. Everybody likes to have stuff that they just that's mind-numbing and dumb. And I'm sure that you watch all sorts of things that lack educational or intellectual value. It's we all need our vegetable time. And if I want to watch The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City and watch them get really mad at each other over the most minor slights and interactions that is all completely fake and contrived and super dramatic, I will. And I won't feel bad about it. So stop shaming people.
I'm with you on this. I'm just sad that you picked Real Housewives instead of Vanderpump Rules, because then we could talk about Vanderpump Rules. And
Maybe I'll try that as well.
But I agree with you. And I think who's like the biggest bore you can imagine? It's always somebody who only wants to talk about intellectual things, who's only reading deep philosophy. And like we do a ton of that. People need a mental break. Normal people need a mental break. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to be highbrow all the time. I think it's just this really ridiculous assertion that you can't partake in junk, right? Consumerism and still be smart. Of course you can. And in some ways, I would say that makes you smarter because you're more attuned to what average people are watching and caring about and talking about. And reality TV is, while contrived, still an excellent study on socioeconomics and psychology. There is so much you can pick up from watching reality TV and how people interact with one another. So I would actually take it a step further and say reality TV is, at the end of the day, not lowbrow and quite educational.
I agree. I think
right, guys.
my other hot take is that somebody should fund and create a reality TV show for political influencers, and I would totally do it, and it would be so dramatic.
Somebody asked me about that a number of years ago, back when I was lobbying, and they were asking if I would consider doing this. This was in reality TV. It was a producer, and I did not feel like I could at the time because so much of what you're doing with lobbying, like it needs to be private. But now, in the kind of work we do now, I think that could be very much a hit TV show. So if you're listening,
if we have any reality TV executives in our audience, hit us up.
We do. Senya is on the call as we speak.
Yeah.
Our producer.
She was a producer, though, not an executive, I think.
Yeah. Well, Senya, if you like the idea, let's talk after the show. All right, guys, that's a wrap. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Leave us a comment. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. And until next week, stay based.